Welcome to Garden Plants with Jim Putnam. Let's talk about green penguin pine. This is Pinus sylvestris green penguin. Pinus sylvestris, otherwise known as Scots pine. They're native to Scotland and into Norway, Sweden. You know, very northern conifer. This one was found in a seedling tray of other Pinus sylvestris or other Scots pines, and it just had this unique habit. Green penguin's kind of the perfect name for it because it kind of has a little bit of a penguin shape, right? It has this really rich dark green coloration in it and this really super compact habit and upright narrow growth. This is October as we're filming this, and the entire plant has kind of settled into this really rich dark green color. But in the spring and even a little bit in the fall, I can see it starting to try to grow now. It has a slightly lighter green coloration on the newest growth, and you can see how just the super compact the habit is on this. It'll only grow about 3 to 5 inches a year, something like that. Ultimately, you know, over a 10-year period of time, it can get 4 to 5 feet in height ultimately, but keeps this super narrow habit. We've never pruned it at all. It's been out here on this street location for about 3 years at this point. This is the typical fall thinning season for conifers here. We're in zone 8A in Raleigh, North Carolina, and typically in the fall here you're going to see a little bit of interior thinning on your conifers, and they'll start to put on a little bit of new growth. So if it's abnormally dry going into fall, sometimes this interior thinning can be fairly extreme, but it's not abnormal to see some brown needles in it in the fall time frame. These are hardy in zone 3 to 7 for sure, but we are in zone 8 here in Raleigh and have gotten away with having it planted here by underplanting it with some other plants. I'll explain a little more what I mean by allowing it to grow in zone 8 by protecting its roots now. This plant's in the full sun from 8 a.m. until mid to late afternoon. And if I didn't have things planted kind of around its roots like this, the ground would just get so hot around it that I don't think it would perform very well out here. It does need the sun like a lot of conifers, but then when we get further into the deep south, it's like, well, how do you keep it in the sun but keep it from, you know, the roots from frying on them? And so we have a sedum, a ground cover sedum, variegated on one side, and then there's some annual vinca on the other. So the peak of the summer, the roots are cool on this plant, despite the fact that the top of the plant is in the full sun. And that's kind of the way we're getting away with having it growing out there. We also have to think about, though, not letting these things do any damage to it. So a couple times a season, we're cutting the vinca away from it, cutting the sedum away from it, making sure they're not actually damaging it, and they're actually only helping it. So definitely full sun, the more the better. Otherwise, it's gonna end up as a very thin plant in the future. Where are you gonna use a plant like this? Well, it's a perfect container plant since it's hardy in zone 3 to 7. I mean, most everyone can keep it in a container even through the winter time. Great is just an accent or specimen plant, and we've had it as a specimen plant at the front entry to our garden. It's one of the first things everyone sees when they get here, and it's so unique and interesting. Everybody wants to know what it is. We had 800 people in the garden one time, and that was one of the top plants that everybody wanted to know what it was. And then of course we're in a small city space, or a very small postage stamp lot, and we're looking for things that are kind of tall and narrow and interesting that don't take up a tremendous corner of the entire lot, but give us some interest here in the garden. Of course, perfect for rock gardens, patio gardens, any place you need something that's tall and narrow that makes a big impact without eating a lot of space. These Scots pines aren't necessarily very picky about the type of soil that they're in, but they do need really well-drained soil. So when I planted this, it's on a bit of a mound. There's a slope here. I'm making sure that this thing doesn't end up overwatered at any time. I would call this plant pretty drought tolerant once established, meaning that if you're in an area that gets regular rainfall, it's probably fine most of the time unless it becomes abnormally dry. But again, it's hard to trust conifers, on when to on when they're dry, because they don't really let us know. They just start thinning on the interior. So this is a plant that I would check on if it becomes, you go some period, a month or something without rain. but you're in an area that typically gets pretty regular rainfall. Of course, if you're growing it somewhere in the Pacific Northwest or something like that, you're gonna have seasonally dry periods of time where you are gonna have to water it. Just make sure the soil is well drained, but it's overall not particularly picky about whether that's clay or sand or whatever. It just doesn't want to sit in water. So you can see how we used it here. It's just one of the first things people are going to see as they walk up to the garden, you know, in front of our, you know, framing this little fence and framing the pathway. And it just is immediate, like, what is that thing? Kind of a really super interesting plant. In all likelihood, you're going to have to find this one mail order from somewhere. It's, you know, a rather specialized plant. It really doesn't need any additional fertilizer, but we fertilize this entire garden in February or early March with an organic fertilizer once a year. We're keeping it weed-free and having it mulched around it, but we're actually using a living mulch during the peak of the summer. So that sedum I consider basically a mulch, right? And this vinca to be kind of a mulch around those roots to try to keep them a little bit cooler. Outside of that, not a lot of maintenance to do on it. You can prune, if you get a crazy limb on it somehow, you know, that sticks out a little further than others, you can kind of cut that anytime. I don't think you're going to have to do really any kind of general pruning on it ever. This is how it's grown all by itself for 3 years. We haven't done a thing to this, again, other than fertilize it once a year and put some living mulch around it. And then seem to be pretty pollution tolerant, deer resistant, a lot of benefits in terms of that, you know, in terms of that. You put this in a well-drained space, water it when it needs water, fertilize it or don't. Easy peasy. This is a green penguin pine.